The moment Henrietta Winslow stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas, in the dry autumn of 1882, she understood with perfect clarity that she had traveled 900 miles only to trade one cage for another. The dust settled around her boots in a fine red cloud, and she stood there gripping her carpetbag with both hands, watching the town materialize through the haze like something half-formed and uncertain of itself. Caldwell was a cattle town, raw-boned and loud, sitting right on the edge of the Kishom Trail where it crossed into Indian territory. Buildings leaned against each other for support along the main street, their painted signs already fading from the relentless Kansas sun. Horses stood tied at every post. Men moved with purpose between the saloon, the livery, and the general store, and not one of them glanced twice at a woman arriving alone with nothing but a single bag and a face set hard against whatever came next. She was 24 years old, and she had not chosen one single thing in her life that she could name with honesty. Her father, Archibald Winslow, had chosen her education, her clothing, her friends, and the church she attended every Sunday in Columbus, Ohio. When she was 19, he had chosen the man she would marry, a banker named Gerald Prout who was 41 years old and smelled of tobacco and old wood. Gerald had chosen where they lived, what she cooked, how she spent her hours, and whether she was permitted to visit her sister 3 streets over. For 5 years she had lived in Gerald Prout's house like a piece of good furniture, present, useful, silent, and never consulted. When Gerald died of a heart seizure in the spring of 1882, Henrietta had stood beside his grave in the cemetery and waited to feel something. She had waited a long time. What finally came was not grief, but a low, slow sensation she would only later recognize as the first breath she had ever truly taken. Within 3 months she had sold the house, written a letter to a cousin in Caldwell who ran a boarding house, and stepped aboard a westbound train for the first time in her life. Her father had written her 4 letters of increasing anger. She had not answered a single one. The boarding house was run by her cousin Vera Hutchins, who was short and broad-shouldered, and wore her hair in a braid down her back like a woman who had long since stopped caring what anyone thought of the arrangement. Vera met Henrietta at the edge of the main street and walked her down a side road to a 2-story wooden building with a sign that read Hutchins Clean Rooms and Meals. "You look like you haven't slept in 3 days, Vera said, swinging open the front door. "I haven't," Henrietta said. "The train." "Cattle towns aren't quiet either," Vera warned, but her voice was warm. "But you'll get used to it. You can work in the kitchen if you want something to do, or the laundry." "I won't demand it, but idle hands in a place like this tend to find trouble." "I want to earn my keep," Henrietta said at once, and she meant it with more force than she expected. Vera gave her a long, measuring look. "All right then, we'll figure it out together." She had a room on the 2nd floor that looked out over the backyard where 2 cottonwood trees dropped yellow leaves in a constant slow rain. The bed was narrow and the mattress lumpy, and it was the first bed Henrietta had slept in that was entirely and completely her own. She lay on it the first night and stared at the ceiling and listened to the town outside, the distant piano from the saloon, a dog barking, a man laughing too loud in the alley, and she thought, "This is mine. This small, narrow, lumpy thing is mine, and no one put me here but me." She slept better than she had in 5 years. The weeks settled into a rhythm. Henrietta worked in the kitchen at dawn, helping with biscuits and salt pork and coffee for the boarders, and then spent the middle hours doing laundry or helping Vera with accounts, which needed considerable help because Vera was generous to a fault with credit and kept approximate records at best. In the afternoons, Henrietta sometimes walked the town, learning its edges and its people with the careful attention of someone who had spent a long time watching from windows. She noticed things. She noticed that the blacksmith, a Cherokee man named Thomas Groundhog, was never called by his name by most of the white men in town, only by a dismissive gesture and the word "hey." She noticed that the Mexican women who washed linens for the hotel were paid half what Vera paid her own girls. She noticed that the marshal, a thick-necked man named Holly's Bean, looked right through anyone who wasn't white and male, and propertied when disputes arose. These things settled into her chest like stones she couldn't put down, and she didn't yet know what to do with them except to notice them honestly and not pretend they weren't there. It was in the 5th week of her time in Caldwell that she first saw Emmett Hartwell. He came in from the trail on a Thursday, riding a red roan horse that was lathered but not blown, which told her he'd ridden hard but not carelessly. He was tall in the saddle, lean in the way of men who worked hard and ate what was available rather than what was plentiful, with dark hair under a worn brown hat and a jaw that needed a razor. He wore canvas trousers and a dusty canvas duster, and he had the look of a man who'd been out in open country long enough to have forgotten what walls felt like. He tied his horse at the post outside the general store, and then he did something Henrietta noticed because she'd stopped noticing most men by then. He paused and looked at the horse's left rear hoof before he went inside. Not perfunctory, not show. He knelt down and looked carefully, like the horse's comfort mattered to him before his own errand did. She filed this away without knowing why. She encountered him properly that same evening, because he had taken a room at Vera's boarding house, one of the upstairs rooms across the narrow hall from hers. He was at the supper table when she came down, sitting at the end with his hat off and his dark hair still damp from washing. He had introduced himself to Vera by the time Henrietta entered, and Vera pointed to the empty chair and said, "Henrietta, this is Emmett Hartwell. He works for the Carter Ranch south of town." "Emmett, this is my cousin Henrietta Winslow, who is entirely too competent for her own comfort." Henrietta sat down and looked at him and said, "I wouldn't know about that." Emmett Hartwell looked at her with brown eyes that were direct without being rude and said, "I appreciate a woman who won't argue a compliment. Most people can't do either. They argue the compliment or they agree too quickly and it comes off as vanity. Just leaving it sit there is the honest thing." Henrietta had not expected this. She said nothing for a moment, and then she said, "I'll reserve judgment on whether it was a compliment." He smiled at that. It changed his face entirely, the way a match lit in a dark room changes the whole character of the space. "Fair enough," he said, and reached for the salt. He stayed 2 days that time, resting his horse and picking up supplies for the Carter Ranch, and during those 2 days Henrietta observed him the way she had learned to observe everything carefully, from a slight distance, noting what things meant rather than just what they appeared. He was quiet at meals but not withdrawn. He was courteous to Vera, helped carry a water barrel without being asked, and said good morning to the 2 other boarders, a traveling drummer named Simmons and an older man named Clark who was looking to buy land. He also said good morning to the girl who swept the kitchen, a Mexican girl named Pillar who was 15 and generally invisible to the men who passed through. On his second morning, Henrietta came down early and found him in the kitchen doorway talking to Pillar, not about anything important, just asking whether she'd grown up in Kansas or come up from Texas, listening to her answer with actual attention. When Pillar saw Henrietta and startled slightly, Emmett Hartwell turned and said good morning without any awkwardness about being caught in a kind act. Henrietta poured herself coffee and thought, interesting. He left Thursday morning. She watched from the kitchen window as he saddled the roan, checked that left rear hoof again with the same patient care, and rode south. She didn't wave. She didn't know him well enough for that. But she noticed that when he was gone, there was a small, specific absence in the house that hadn't been there before he arrived. She didn't examine that feeling too closely. She had spent 24 years being told what she felt and why, and she was still in the early weeks of learning to trust her own interior life. She let the feeling sit without naming it, the way Emmett Hartwell had let the almost compliment sit untouched. He came back 3 weeks later, and then again 2 weeks after that. The Carter Ranch was a working cattle operation, and Emmett was their head trail rider, which meant he made regular runs into Caldwell for supplies and correspondence, and to deliver cattle to the holding pens for buyers coming up the trail. Each time he came, he took a room at Vera's, and each time he stayed 2 or 3 days. Vera noticed before Henrietta did. Vera was perceptive the way women who run boarding houses become perceptive. She watched human nature cross her threshold daily and had developed an encyclopedic sense for its patterns. She said nothing for the first several visits, but after the 4th one, she sat down across from Henrietta at the kitchen table on a quiet afternoon and said, "Emmett Hartwell is a good man." Henrietta looked up from the account book. "Is that relevant to the figures we're trying to balance?" "No," Vera said serenely. "I just thought you should hear it from someone who knows this town." "I barely know the man," Henrietta said. "You know him better than you're letting yourself think," Vera said, and went back to her mending with the satisfied air of someone who has said the necessary thing and requires nothing more. Henrietta stared at the account book for a while without reading it. The 5th visit came in November, when a blue norther had rolled down from the plains and plastered Caldwell in ice-edged wind that cut through every coat and filled the air with flying grit. Emmett arrived looking half-frozen, and Vera hustled him to the fire and produced coffee without ceremony. Henrietta was at the table working on a letter to her sister back in Columbus. She had not written to her father, but Eliza was a different matter, and she looked up as he came in and felt something move in her chest that she had been pretending for several weeks was nothing. He sat down across from her at the table and wrapped his hands around the coffee cup and said, "November in Kansas. I keep forgetting how unreasonable it gets." "You've been here a few years?" she asked. 6 years. "Came out from Missouri in 1876. I keep thinking I'll go back." He looked at the fire. "Haven't gone back yet." "What's keeping you here?" she asked. He thought about it the way she'd noticed he thought about everything, not quickly, not to impress her with a fast answer, but genuinely, like the question deserved the full courtesy of honest consideration. "I think it's that Missouri got smaller," he finally said. "Or I got bigger, one of the two." She set down her pen. "I know exactly what that means." "You came from Ohio," he said. It wasn't a question. Vera had mentioned it at some point, she supposed. "Columbus. My husband died and I left." "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, because people said this, and then he looked at her and said, "Was it a loss?" She was startled enough that she answered honestly, "Not the way it's supposed to be." He nodded once, not pressing it, not making a face of judgment or false sympathy, just accepting what she'd said as the plain truth it was. "Then I'm sorry for the circumstances," he said, which was such a perfectly measured thing to say that she found she had to look away from him for a moment. The evening passed with Vera and the other boarders around the fire, talk about cattle prices and whether the trail season was ending, someone's opinion about the new railroad spurs being pushed south. And through all of it, Emmett Hartwell sat quiet when he had nothing useful to add and spoke plainly when he did. And Henrietta sat in the corner with her letter half finished and thought about Missouri getting smaller and people getting bigger and the particular quality of attention this man had that she was beginning to understand was not common. She had been talked at her whole life. By her father, by Gerald Prout, by every well-meaning neighbor who had an opinion about how she should dress or what she should feel or what she should do next. She had been told things. She had been advised and directed and decided for with such thoroughness that she had lost the thread of her own preferences somewhere around the age of 16 and never fully found it again. Emmett Hartwell listened. Not performed listening, not the patience of a man waiting to talk again, but actual listening, where he changed based on what he heard. She had never, she was beginning to realize, encountered this in a man before. The weather kept him an extra day. He used the day to help Thomas Groundhog at the blacksmith shop with a broken wheel assembly that needed more than 2 hands, and Henrietta happened to walk past and see him there in the cold, hammering iron alongside Thomas with the unself-conscious competence of someone who worked because the work needed doing, and not because anyone was watching. Thomas called him by his name. Emmett called Thomas by his. She walked on, and the stone in her chest had become something different from a stone. It was December before she fully understood what was happening, and December before she let herself sit with it honestly. The town had quieted with the end of the cattle season. The trail riders who weren't wintering on ranches had mostly moved on, and Caldwell was left to its permanent population and the slow, cold weeks before Christmas. Emmett was wintering at the Carter Ranch but came in once a week to collect mail and supplies, and she had begun to suspect, for other reasons as well. He started arriving on Thursdays. He always stayed Friday, sometimes Saturday. He always sat at the supper table and always, without apparent design, ended up in whatever conversation she was in. One Thursday evening in mid-December, the boarding house was quiet. Vera had gone to visit a neighbor. Simmons the drummer had moved on. Clark had bought his land and departed. And it was only Emmett and Henrietta and the fire and the wind pushing hard against the windows. She had been reading a novel she'd borrowed from the small lending library the post office kept, and he had been going over some figures for the Carter Ranch. And for an hour neither of them had said anything, and the silence had been entirely comfortable in the way that only silence between two people who genuinely suit each other can be. He set down his pen and looked at the fire for a moment, and then he looked at her and said, "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask," she said. "What do you want?" he said. "Not about tonight, not about supper. I mean in general, from your life. What do you want it to look like?" She looked up from her book and stared at him. He seemed to understand the magnitude of what he just asked because he added, "You don't have to answer right now, or at all if you don't want to. I've noticed you seem like someone who's been a long time without anyone asking, so I'm asking." She put the book down. She had never once been asked what she wanted, not once in 24 years. Her father had told her what she wanted. Gerald had assumed he knew. Her mother, before she died, had told her what a good woman wanted and why. Not one single person had ever set the question before her like a clean plate and then waited quietly while she decided what to put on it. The silence stretched. Emmett Hartwell said absolutely nothing. He turned back to his figures, not in dismissal but in the deliberate generosity of a man giving space to someone who needs it, and she understood that he was doing this on purpose, that he'd asked and was now genuinely, unhurriedly willing to wait days or weeks or longer for whatever answer she might eventually arrive at. She sat with the question for a long time that night. She sat with it the next morning over coffee while he was out in the stable seeing to the roan. She sat with it through the afternoon while she helped Vera take inventory of the kitchen stores. She was still sitting with it that evening when she came into the sitting room and found him by the fire reading the week-old newspaper from Wichita, and she sat down in the chair across from him and said, "I want to decide things." He looked up. "Not big things necessarily," she said. "I don't know yet what the big things are, but the small things, what I read, where I walk, whether I stay in a place or leave it, whether I answer a letter or don't. I want to be the one making those decisions. I've never been that person and I want to be." He folded the newspaper and set it on his knee and listened to her with all his attention. "I think I might want to stay in Caldwell," she continued, because once she'd started she found the words came in a rush, like water from a pipe that had been frozen too long. "I think I might want to be here permanently, not just as a stop. Vera needs real help with the books and the management, and I'm good at it. And I like the town even though it's rough. I like that it's rough. I like that it doesn't have an opinion about me yet. And I think," she paused and made herself be honest, "I think I want to keep having supper with you. That's one of the things I want." Emmett Hartwell looked at her steadily. His brown eyes were serious and warm at once. "I'm glad you said that last part," he said, "because it's the same one I'd have put on the list." She felt heat rise in her face, which surprised her because she'd thought herself past blushing. "I'm not finished figuring it out," she said. "There might be more." "Take all the time you need," he said simply, and meant it entirely, and that was somehow the most startling and the most beautiful thing he had said yet. They did not rush. This was the character of how it went between them, and it suited them both, though for different reasons. For Henrietta, It was about the extraordinary novelty of having time at all time to think, to change her mind, to arrive at a feeling without being pointed toward it. For Emmett, the patience came from a different kind of history, one he told her in pieces over the course of the winter, like a man laying out cards slowly, making sure she saw each one clearly. He had been engaged once. He told her on a cold January evening when they'd stayed late by the fire after Vera had gone to bed. A woman in Missouri named Clara, whom he'd known since childhood and had assumed he would marry because that was the shape his future had always taken. They had been engaged for a year before Clara told him plainly that she didn't want to go to Kansas, that she didn't want the kind of life he was building, and that she had only said yes because she hadn't known how to say no to a man she'd known her whole life and who clearly expected it. That must have been hard to hear, Henrietta said. It was, he said, and then it wasn't, because once I understood why she'd said yes, that she'd been doing me a kindness she didn't owe me, I was more sorry for her than for myself. She'd spent a year living a life she hadn't chosen because nobody had given her room to choose differently. He looked at the fire. I thought about that for a long time afterward, about how often that happens, how often people, especially women, get carried along by everyone else's expectations and never get the room to say what they actually think. Henrietta was quiet for a moment. And that's why you asked me. That's part of why, he said, and the way he said it left room for the other parts, which they both understood and which neither of them needed to name yet. January was cold enough to crack wood, and the town was slow and quiet under its crust of ice. Henrietta used the quiet months to do what she'd told Emmett she wanted. She made decisions. She formally arranged with Vera to take over the management of the accounts in exchange for room and reduced board. She wrote to her father and told him plainly and without apology that she was staying in Kansas, that she was well, and that she would correspond if he could do so without telling her what to do. She wrote to Eliza every 2 weeks with real news and real feeling. She started attending the small community meetings at the town hall, not because anyone invited her, but because she decided she wanted to be part of the life of this place. She also began to understand, at one of these meetings, that the injustices she had observed in her first weeks in Caldwell were not accidental or individual but systematic, woven into the fabric of how the town operated. At a meeting about the new water rights ordinance, she watched Marshall Holly's Bean dismiss Thomas Groundhog's legitimate concern about the creek access, the blacksmith shop depended on with a wave of his hand, and a comment about how some people's opinions didn't carry the same weight. She watched the Mexican laborers who had built 3 of the town's permanent buildings get no representation in the discussion about how the town funds would be allocated. She said something. She stood up at that meeting. She was the only woman present except for the mayor's wife, who was there as decoration. And she said, in a clear, carrying voice, that Thomas Groundhog's business had been operating at that location for 4 years longer than the ordinance being discussed, and that his water access was therefore a prior claim, and that she had read the territorial law on this point carefully because it was her habit to read carefully, and that anyone who would like to see the relevant passage was welcome to ask her. The room went quite still. Marshall Bean looked at her with the expression of a man presented with an animal he doesn't recognize. Thomas Groundhog looked at her with measured surprise. Emmett Hartwell, who was at the back of the room having come in from the cold midway through, looked at her with what she would later recognize as the look a man gets when he understands something important about a person. Thomas Groundhog's water access was acknowledged. The meeting moved on. Bean said nothing further to her, but she caught his look and understood she had made an administrative enemy, which she filed away as an acceptable consequence. Emmett walked with her back to the boarding house afterward. The night was clear and bitter cold, and their breath came in white clouds, and the stars over Kansas were extraordinary, thick and indifferent, burning above a landscape that didn't care about any of them. You had read the territorial law, he said. I read a great many things, she said. I had time this week. Vera's accounts balanced on Tuesday. He was quiet for a step. "Then you didn't have to do that." "I know," she said. "I wanted to." "Is that on the list?" He asked, and she understood he was referring to her answer by the fire in December, the list of things she wanted. "It's going on the list now," she said. He smiled at the dark street ahead. "The list is getting longer." "I think it might be a very long list," she said, and heard herself say it with a lightness she hadn't known she possessed. He reached out then and found her hand in the dark, just the brush of his fingers against hers, a question rather than a statement, and she turned her hand and let their fingers link together, and they walked the last half-block to the boarding house in the cold and the dark with their hands joined, and she thought, "I chose this. I am choosing this. This is mine." She told Vera that night, sitting in the kitchen with the lamp turned low and the stove still warm. Vera set down her mending and said, "I know," with complete serenity. "You might have said something earlier," Henrietta said. "You needed to get there yourself," Vera said. "That's the point, isn't it?" It was the point. It was entirely the point. February brought a thaw and then more cold and then a genuine softening of the air that suggested spring was considering an early arrival. Emmett's visits extended. He was spending 3 and 4 days at the boarding house now rather than 2, and Henrietta understood this was not entirely because of ranch business, and he understood that she understood, and neither of them pretended otherwise. They went on walks in the stiff, bright afternoon air. They played cards with Vera on quiet evenings. They talked about everything, Missouri and Ohio, cattle prices and railroad politics, what Emmett had seen in 6 years on the trail, and what Henrietta had read about in the books she'd collected on her shelf, which now numbered 11. She told him about Gerald and about her father, not bitterly but honestly, because she found she could be honest with him in a way she'd never been with anyone, and because she needed him to know the shape of where she'd come from in order to understand why where she was mattered so much. He told her about his parents, who had died of fever when he was 20, and about his younger brother David, who ran a dry goods business in Springfield, and about the years right after the fever when he had worked 3 different jobs in 2 states before the Kishom Trail found him and the open country of Kansas gave him something he could only describe as breathing room. "Some people see the plains and feel exposed," he said. "I see them and feel free." "I think I might be the same way," she said, looking out over the brown winter grass stretching flat and enormous to the southern horizon, "though I'm only just learning what free feels like." "How does it feel?" he asked. She thought about it honestly, the way he always deserved. "Frightening," she said, "and enormous, like when you open a door and didn't know what was on the other side and it turns out to be a whole other country." "That's about right," he said. The roan horse, whose name she had learned was August, named for the month Emmett had bought him, recovered from a stone bruise he'd been nursing through the winter, and Emmett began offering to take Henrietta riding on Sunday afternoons when the weather permitted. She had ridden as a girl and loved it, and Gerald had considered it improper for a married woman of her station, and so she had not been on a horse in 5 years. She was stiff the first Sunday and laughed at herself for it, and Emmett kept his face straight with obvious effort and said nothing, which she appreciated enormously. By the 3rd Sunday she had found her seat again, and they rode east along the creek, where the cottonwoods were beginning to push out pale green leaves, the first real color after the long gray winter, and Emmett rode beside her on a borrowed gelding with the easy, long-limbed looseness of a man who spent more time on horseback than off, and the afternoon light was yellow and gentle. And Henrietta Winslow looked at this man beside her and this landscape around her, and felt something so complete and warm, and certain that she had to sit with it quietly for the whole ride back to make sure she understood it correctly. She understood it correctly. March came in hard, the way Kansas March does, with thunderstorms that rolled across the flat country like walls and turned the streets to red mud and the creek to a brown surge. Vera's roof developed a leak over the back bedroom, and Emmett spent a Saturday in the rain patching it with no prompting and considerable competence, And Henrietta stood at the kitchen window watching him work and thought about what it meant to be seen, to be listened to have a person who asked what you wanted, and then waited unhurriedly for your answer, and did not make you feel foolish for taking time to find it. She went out in the rain. Not to help the roof was nearly done, but because she wanted to be where he was, which she had learned to take seriously as a want. She stood at the base of the ladder in the cold March rain and looked up at him, and he looked down at her and raised his eyebrows. "You're getting soaked," he said. "I know," she said. "I wanted to tell you something." "Tell it then," he said in the patient tone that was so distinctly his. "I love you," she said. "I have been figuring that out since December, and I am fairly certain about it now. I thought you should know." He was quiet for a moment in the rain, looking at her with his hat brim channeling water in a steady pour. Then he said, "I love you too, Henrietta. I've known it for longer than December." "How long?" she asked. "That first supper," he said, "when you didn't argue the compliment." She laughed, standing in the rain on the muddy ground, and it rose out of her like something that had been waiting a long time to be released. He came down the ladder, and she was still laughing, and he took her face in his hands, and looked at her with the directness and warmth that she had come to understand was the truest thing about him. And then he kissed her in the rain in the side yard of Vera's boarding house, and she kissed him back with the full, unambiguous weight of a decision she had made herself. Vera, watching from the kitchen window, put her mending down and said finally to no one in particular. It was Emmett who raised the question of the future first, and he raised it the way he raised everything, directly and without assumptions. They were sitting at the kitchen table one evening in early April, the windows open to the warm smell of spring rain and new grass, and he said, "I want to ask you something, but I don't want to ask it wrong." "Ask it," she said. "I'll tell you if it's wrong." "I want to ask if you want to marry me," he said, "but that's not the full question. The full question is whether apart from me, apart from what I might want, whether that's something you want for your life. Because I've watched you spend these months building something that's yours, and I would not want to be a reason that stops." She looked at him across the lamplit table and felt the full, extraordinary weight of being asked. Not told, not assumed, asked. "It's a good question," she said. "Can I answer it properly?" "Take as long as you need," he said, and reached across the table and covered her hand with his. And then he did what she was learning was one of his deepest courtesies. He waited. He didn't hover or prompt or watch her face for clues. He released her hand gently and poured them both more coffee and sat quietly with his own thoughts while she worked through hers. She thought about the cage she had arrived in. She thought about the cage she had come from. She thought about the difference between a person you are given and a person you choose, and the immeasurable significance of that difference. She thought about the supper table in December, and the walk in the cold and his fingers finding hers in the dark, and the ride along the creek with the new green leaves. She thought about what it meant that every single time he had asked her what she wanted, he had then sat quietly and let her figure it out without interference or impatience. She thought about the boarding house that was becoming home, and about Vera who was becoming family, and about Thomas Groundhog and Pillar, and the town meeting and the territorial law, and the particular satisfaction of using herself fully and well in a place that needed her. She thought about August the roan horse and the Sunday rides, and the fact that last Sunday she had outpaced him by a quarter mile, and he had been entirely delighted about it. "Yes," she said, "I want to marry you. Not because I don't know what else to do, and not because anyone expects it, and not because of what it provides. Because I want you specifically, in my life, permanently. I want your company and your honesty and the way you think about things. I want to keep having supper with you every night. I want to ride with you on Sunday mornings. I want to argue with you about books you haven't read and hear about cattle you've driven and sit in silence with you when there's nothing to say. I want all of it. I'm choosing it." He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face was so open and unguarded that she thought she had never seen a man look quite like that before. "All right," he said softly. "Then yes, let's do that." They told Vera that evening. Vera stood up from her chair, embraced them both, and immediately began making practical plans about where a married couple might live given that the boarding house was too small for a full domestic life, which was so entirely and perfectly Vera that both of them laughed. The practical question was a real one, and they addressed it with the same honest, unhurried care they brought to everything. Emmett's arrangement with the Carter Ranch was good, but a ranch hand's life was not a settled domestic life, and Henrietta had built something at the boarding house she was not willing to abandon. They talked about it over several evenings, and then Emmett brought it to old Mr. Carter, who was 68 and tired, and had been looking for someone to buy the south quarter of his land for 2 years, 20 acres with a small creek and a stand of post oak and an existing one-room homestead building that needed work but had good bones. Emmett had saved carefully over 6 years of trail wages. It was enough for the land and not much more, but Henrietta had the proceeds from the Columbus house which she had put in the new bank in Wichita and had not touched because she had not until now known what she wanted to spend them on. She knew now. They bought the 20 acres together in both their names, which was not the common practice but which was not impossible under Kansas law and which Emmett had researched carefully because he wanted it done correctly and completely. Both names, he confirmed with her, sitting across from the land office clerk who was looking at them with mild bureaucratic puzzlement. Jointly held, equal ownership. The clerk looked at Henrietta. She looked back at him steadily. He filled in the form. They were married in June of 1883 at the small Methodist church on the edge of Caldwell's Main Street, on a morning that was already hot but had a south wind moving through it that kept the heat friendly rather than brutal. Vera was Henrietta's witness, a Carter Ranch hand named Pete Duckett, who had worked beside Emmett for 4 years and had a slow, genuine laugh and a talent for telling stories about horses that went on longer than necessary, stood with Emmett. Thomas Groundhog came and sat in the back pew and nodded to Henrietta when she came up the aisle in her good blue dress, which she had chosen herself from Vera's catalog with no input from anyone, and which suited her exactly. The minister was a young man named Reverend Claypool, who had been in Caldwell 8 months, and was still slightly bewildered by the density of human events moving through a cattle town, and he read the ceremony with genuine attention and only stumbled once. At the moment he asked if anyone present knew any reason the marriage should not proceed, and from the back of the church came the sound of Pete Duckett suppressing a laugh about something, which caused Emmett to achieve a perfectly controlled expression that Henrietta recognized immediately as his version of wanting to laugh. She looked at him at the altar in his good dark jacket and his clean hat and thought, "This is the man who asked me what I wanted and then sat quietly. This is the man who waited." She said her vows clearly and without hesitation because she had chosen them. The homestead on the south quarter was where their real life began, and they built it the way they had built everything else between them, steadily, honestly, and together. The one-room structure became 2 rooms by September because Emmett was competent with timber and Henrietta was competent with a plan, and she drew the expansion out on paper with careful measurements, and he cut the lumber to them without commentary, which she found she loved about him deeply and specifically. She continued managing Vera's accounts, riding the 2 miles into town 3 mornings a week on a steady bay mare named Clara. She had named this one herself and had chosen the name deliberately, in honor of the woman in Missouri who had understood something important about choice. Emmett took on the trial management for Carter's remaining cattle operation, which was winding down as the old man's health declined, and supplemented this with a small herd of his own on their 20 acres and work as a hired hand for 2 of the smaller ranches south of town during the busy seasons. Their life had the particular texture of frontier life in 1883, physically demanding, economically careful, socially rich in the way that small communities under hard conditions tend to be. They knew their neighbors honestly, the Nuyens who had come up from New Orleans and were farming the 40 acres east of the creek, an older Vietnamese couple whose son Lee worked as a translator for some of the trail business, the Vasquez family who kept goats and sold excellent cheese to the hotel kitchen. Thomas Groundhog, whose blacksmith shop was now the finest within 60 miles, and who had a wife named Sarah, and 3 children who ran through the town with absolute unsupervised confidence. These were the people Henrietta considered her community, and she was fierce about them in the way she was fierce about Thomas's water rights, present, researched, and unwilling to be dismissed. When the next town meeting produced a debate about whether Chinese and Mexican children could attend the new school that was being organized with territorial funds, Henrietta stood up and said the relevant thing plainly and clearly and without apology, and this time she was not alone. Emmett stood up beside her, not to speak over her but to be present beside her, and several other permanent residents stood with them, and the motion to restrict the school was tabled and eventually failed. She talked to him about all of it that night by the fire in their 2-room homestead. He listened and asked questions and occasionally offered an observation, and never once told her what she should have said or done differently. "Do you ever disagree with me?" she asked once, not argumentatively, genuinely curious. He thought about it. "Sometimes," he said. "I thought you were too hard on Bean at the March meeting, the one about the fencing ordinance. I thought you had the right argument, but the delivery made it harder for the people who were sympathetic to vote with you publicly." She stared at him. "You could have said so." "I was getting to it," he said. "I wanted to make sure I was right about it first." "Were you?" "Yes," he said, not without gentleness. "I think Bean went home more defensive than he needed to, and it cost us some of the April votes." She thought about it. "All right," she said. "Tell me how you would have said it," he told her. She listened. She disagreed with part of it, and they argued it out across the table with the comfortable intensity of 2 people who trusted each other completely, and by the time the lamp needed trimming they had arrived at something better than either of them had come in with. This, she thought, was what it was supposed to be. 2 people who took each other seriously enough to disagree, and trusted each other enough to change their minds. By the winter of 1883 she understood she was expecting a child. She told Emmett on a Thursday evening in December, exactly a year from the evening he had asked her what she wanted, and the timing was not lost on either of them. He looked at her with that open, unguarded expression that she had come to love, and then he said, "How do you feel about it?" And she loved him with a force that was almost physical for asking that first rather than anything else. "I'm frightened," she said honestly. "And glad, and I want it very much." "Then I'm all of those things too," he said. The pregnancy moved through the winter with the practical discomfort of all such things, and Henrietta managed it with characteristic determination, not stopping her work at Vieira's or her work at the homestead or her presence at town meetings, though she accepted in February that riding the bay mare on the frozen road was an imprudence, and let Emmett drive her in the small wagon on her town days. She resented the limitation with a cheerful resentment that she told him about directly, and he received with sympathy and absolutely no suggestion that she should stop being annoyed. "You can be annoyed," he said. "The road's frozen. Both things are true." "I am glad you are not the sort of man who tells me how I should feel about being unable to do things I want to do," she said. "I've gathered that would go poorly," he said, which was both true and funny enough that she forgave the road. Their son was born in April of 1884, which Emmett noted was an excellent month for arrivals in Kansas. The last hard cold was done, and the grass was coming. They named him August James Hartwell. August for the roan horse who had first shown her that Emmett Hartwell was a man who paid careful attention to living things, and James for Emmett's father. He was small and loud, and had dark hair like his father, and an expression in his first week that Vieira described as deeply skeptical about the entire enterprise of being born. Henrietta held him in the quiet of their home on the first evening after the difficult labor, with the April wind gentle outside the window and Emmett sitting close beside her, and she thought about everything that had come before this: the stagecoach pulling into Caldwell in the red dust, the cold supper table, the December fire, and the question she had never been asked before. She had traveled 900 miles to trade one cage for another. She had thought on arrival. She had been wrong. She had traveled 900 miles to finally step out of the cage entirely. She told Emmett this, sitting with their son between them. He was quiet for a moment. "You let yourself out," he said. "I just asked the question." "The question was the most important thing anyone had ever done for me at that point in my life," she said. "That's a low bar," he said very gently. "You deserved better than that long before Caldwell." "I know," she said. "But I'm not sure I would have known what to do with it earlier. I think I had to come here and be empty first to know what I wanted to fill it with." He looked at August in her arms and then at her face. "Are you filled?" he asked. She considered the homestead around her, the 20 acres that were hers, the town 2 miles away that she was changing slowly and stubbornly one meeting at a time, the work she did that mattered, the people she had made into family, and this man beside her who had asked her a question, and then waited in silence while she found her way to the answer. "Getting there," she said, which was honest and which made him smile in the way that still changed the whole room. August James Hartwell proved to be a child of vigorous opinions and perpetual motion, and the house that had been 2 rooms became, by necessity, 3 by the time he was walking. He followed his father everywhere on the homestead with the focused intensity of a small person who is determined to understand all mechanisms, and he followed his mother to town with an equal intensity that expressed itself differently sitting in Vera's kitchen watching what was happening, tugging on sleeves to be included in conversations, developing at age 2 an enormous and extremely specific interest in the horses at the livery. Thomas Groundhog's daughter Nora was a year older than August and his closest companion from the time they were toddling, and the sight of the 2 of them pelting across the open ground between the Hartwell homestead and the Groundhog blacksmith shop, as Thomas had expanded his operation to a full smithy with a small attached stable on the edge of town, became so common as to be unremarkable. Henrietta turned 26 and 27. The town grew and the trail slowed, because the railroad was pushing south and making the long drives less necessary, and Caldwell changed with it in ways both good and difficult. The good. The permanent population grew and brought with it a real school, a proper doctor who was not the previous man and who understood that clean hands before a procedure was not an eccentric practice, a small lending library that was its own genuine institution, and which Henrietta helped establish, and over which she had a quiet, effective authority. The difficult. The end of the cattle trade meant the end of certain economies that some families had depended on, and she and Emmett and the Vasquez family and the Nuyens and Thomas Groundhog navigated the shift together with the practicality of people who had learned to take problems as things to be solved rather than disasters to be mourned. Old Mr. Carter died in the winter of 1885. And his land went to his nephew in Wichita, who had no interest in working it and considerable interest in selling it. And Emmett and Henrietta talked about this for 3 evenings running with the careful, honest thoroughness they brought to every significant decision. The Carter land adjoined their south quarter, adding it would mean real commitment to ranching as a primary operation rather than supplement. It would mean debt, carefully managed. It would mean Emmett spending more time on the land and less time as hired hand, which was a thing he wanted but which required the ranch to produce. "What do you want?" she asked him on the 3rd evening, turning his own question back on him with full intentionality. He looked at her with a smile that acknowledged this. "I want the land," he said. "I want to build something permanent here, but I need you to tell me honestly what it means for the things you're doing. The library, Vera's accounts, the school board. I can do all of those things from a bigger ranch as well as a smaller one," she said. "What changes is where the work happens, not whether I do it." "You're sure?" "I'm sure of what I want," she said. "The question is whether we can make the numbers work." They could make the numbers work. They did. The Carter land was theirs by spring of 1886, and the Hartwell place went from 20 acres to 140. With a proper ranch house started in the summer of that year, 4 rooms and a covered porch facing south, and a real kitchen with a stove that was not the original homestead's small iron box, and space in the upstairs room for Auguste's increasing accumulation of objects he had decided were important. Feathers, smooth stones, a broken watch that Emmett had given him to take apart, a series of drawings he made with impressive focus and no technical skill whatsoever. The expanded ranch also needed hands, and the hands Emmett hired were chosen with the same care he brought to everything else: competence first, and no tolerance for men who could not treat the Nguyen family or the Vasquez family or Thomas Groundhog as they deserved. He lost one man over this early on, a capable roper named Jacobs who made a scene in town about service at the general store that included language Emmett would not have in his employ, and the parting was crisp and clear, and Emmett did not lose sleep over it. Henrietta, watching this from the porch as Jacobs rode off the property, said, "I'm going to marry you all over again." Emmett came up the porch steps and stood beside her. "We could do that," he said. "I'm not serious," she said. "I am, however, extremely fond of you." "Extremely fond," he repeated, amused. "I love you wildly and completely, and I chose you, and I would choose you again every morning, and I'm extremely fond of you," she said. "The fond is a separate and specific thing." "I'll take all of them," he said. Vera's boarding house changed too as the town changed. By 1886, the transient cattle trade that had kept it full was reduced, and Vera converted 2 of the upstairs rooms into permanent long-term lets for the schoolteacher and the doctor's young assistant. She also, to Henrietta's private satisfaction, began keeping excellent accounts entirely on her own, having apparently absorbed the fundamentals over years of observation. She told Henrietta this with some dignity, and Henrietta expressed only approval and zero surprise, which was the correct response. It was Pete Duckett, Emmett's witness at their wedding, who brought the trouble in the summer of 1886. Not through any fault of his own, but because he arrived at the Hartwell ranch on a Tuesday morning with a message that a man named Riker had moved onto the disputed section of land on the western edge of the Carter property, the section that had an old survey irregularity that the previous land sale had not fully resolved. Henrietta set down the bread she was making and asked Pete to tell her everything he knew about the survey irregularity, which was not much, and then she asked him to stay for coffee, which he did, and by the time the coffee was done, she had the core of the problem clear. The original Carter survey from 1871 had a disputed 8-acre section on the northwest corner where 2 surveys overlapped, and a man named Riker, who had come in from Colorado and was sharp in a specific legal way that meant he had been looking for exactly this kind of vulnerability, had filed a claim on that section with the land office in Wichita. Emmett came in from the South Field, and she told him what she knew and what she thought needed to happen. He listened and said, "Can the survey be corrected?" "The original survey can be challenged," she said. "We need the 1871 fieldwork documents from the Wichita office, and we need a current surveyor to walk the line. If the original monuments are still in the ground, we can establish the actual boundary." "Do you know a surveyor?" "I know of one," she said. "He did the Nguyen property line last year. He's good." "All right," he said. "How do you want to handle Riker in the meantime?" "Civilly," she said, "but clearly. He should understand the boundary is disputed before he does any building." Emmett looked at her with that expression she knew: assessment and absolute confidence combined. "You want to go talk to him?" "I think we should go talk to him," she said, "together." They went together, which she had noted was always the best approach to things that required both directness and the suggestion that the person they were dealing with was not going to find any useful advantage in an argument. Riker was a lean man in his 40s with careful eyes and the quality of someone who made his money from other people's oversights, and he received them in front of his temporary camp on the disputed section with studied calm. Henrietta told him about the survey dispute clearly and without accusation. She named the 1871 document. She mentioned the current surveyor's name and the timeline she expected. She said she expected the boundary to be fully settled within 60 days and that she would share the survey results with him directly and in writing. Riker listened with his careful eyes and said, "You seem very confident." "I'm usually well prepared," she said pleasantly. The survey confirmed their boundary. Riker's claim had been built on the incorrect survey line, and when presented with the corrected documents, he withdrew it without additional incident. Henrietta thought this was partly because the documents were unambiguous and partly because he had assessed them on that first visit, and understood that pressing the matter would be expensive and unpromising. August thought the whole affair was riveting and asked detailed questions about land surveys for 2 weeks. The autumn of 1886 brought a decision that settled the final shape of their life in a way that felt right and permanent. The school board, which Henrietta had helped establish and on which she had served for 2 years, had been struggling with the position of the schoolteacher. A young woman named Miss Abbott who was excellent at her work, but underpaid to a degree that suggested she might leave for a better position in Wichita before the end of the school year. Henrietta argued at the board meeting for an increase in the teacher's salary that would require an adjustment to the town's education budget, and she came with figures, detailed, sourced, presented in a document she had prepared over 3 evenings, and she made the case clearly and won it. Miss Abbott stayed. The following spring she quietly approached Henrietta and said that she hoped she understood what her advocacy had meant, not just for the salary, but for the general principle that the school was worth proper investment. Henrietta thought about her own education, which had been decided for her, shaped to produce a woman who would be useful in a drawing room and manageable in a house. She thought about what her life might have looked like if someone had asked her early what she wanted from learning. She said to Miss Abbott, "I think the children in this school deserve a teacher who can make a life here. Thank you for making it possible to make that case." Their daughter was born in March of 1887, and they named her Clara Rose Hartwell. Clara again, for the woman in Missouri whose bravery had cost her a year of the wrong life, and whose honesty had ultimately shaped this right one. And Rose because Henrietta had started a kitchen garden the previous spring, and the roses she'd put in along the south fence had come up in exactly the deep red of the dress she'd worn on her first Sunday ride with Emmett along the creek. She was dark-eyed and serious in her first weeks, and August, who had turned 3 the previous April, regarded her with the same systematic interest he brought to all new phenomena, and then pronounced her acceptable, which was the highest available compliment. Emmett held Clara the evening of her birth in the lamplit bedroom of the ranch house, with the March wind working at the windows and the new grass smell beginning to come in from the south, and Henrietta watched him look at his daughter with the particular expression she knew meant he was thinking something real and large. She waited, because she had learned his silences as well as she knew his words. "I want to tell her early," he said finally, "that she gets to decide what she wants from her life, that no one else gets to make that choice for her." "We'll tell her," Henrietta said. "And August," he said. "August too," she said. "Though August seems to have arrived already knowing what he wants, he just has to get tall enough to reach it." Emmett smiled. "He wants to build things, have you noticed? He's not interested in the cattle at all. He takes things apart to understand how they work." "Thomas Groundhog has been teaching him basic metalwork," Henrietta said. "I've been allowing it." Emmett looked at her. "When did that start?" "September." Thomas mentioned August was forever at the shop doorway watching, and he asked if he could bring him in. "I said yes." She paused. "I should have told you." "No," he said. "You decided, that's your right." "It was a joint decision kind of thing," she said. "You made a good decision," he said. "I would have said the same thing, but I like that you made it." She understood what he was saying, that he wanted her to be fully herself within their shared life, not a partial version held back by the habit of checking. She had been working at the ingrained reflex of waiting for permission, and she was better than she had been, and she would be better still. "All right," she said. Then I've already signed August up for an additional hour with Thomas on Saturday mornings through the winter. He laughed, surprised and delighted. Good, he said. The years that followed built themselves with the particular richness of a life that is genuinely inhabited. The Hartwell Ranch became a working proposition of real substance, 30 head of cattle managed with care, and without the scale that would have required compromising everything else, supplemented by Emmett's skill with horses and a growing reputation as a man who could evaluate and train working stock in ways that buyers from Wichita and beyond came specifically seeking. He was fair in his prices and completely honest in his assessments, and word of this spread the way word of genuine quality always does. Henrietta's work with the school board and the library grew into something the town understood as essential. She was not soft about it. She argued for funding, for better books, for the inclusion of subjects that some parents found modern and some board members found impractical, and she was not always popular in these arguments, and she did not change her position because of popularity. But she had learned from the early Bean years to think about delivery as well as content, and she was more effective for it. The library had 300 books by 1888. She knew every one of them. She lent them to anyone who asked, and she made sure everyone in Caldwell understood they could ask. The Vasquez children, Lee Nguyen, who was 16 now and reading at a formidable level, Nora Groundhog, who had a particular appetite for the natural sciences, and who received, on her 9th birthday, a copy of a Sag Gray's botanical manual that Henrietta had ordered specially from a bookseller in St. Louis. She also wrote to her father. She had been writing to him twice a year, brief, civil, informative letters that told him where she was, and that she was well and nothing else. He wrote back with decreasing frequency and increasing resignation, and the last letter she had received from him, 6 months earlier, had contained something she had never expected, an admission that she had been right to leave Columbus. Not an apology, she did not expect that, and she was not certain she needed it. But he had written, "I see now that you were not suited to the life I had arranged for you, and I may not have given sufficient consideration to your own nature. I am glad to hear you are prospering." This was from Archibald Winslow, a seismic shift, and she read the letter several times and showed it to Emmett and then wrote back a letter that was 3 paragraphs longer than her usual, and that contained the first real information about her life she had offered him in years. Emmett read her letter before she sent it and said, "This is generous." "He's 70 years old," she said. "I don't want to carry the old anger forever. It's heavy. What does carrying it versus setting it down feel like?" He asked. She thought about it honestly. "Carrying it feels like protection," she said. "Setting it down feels like I trust that I don't need protection from him anymore. Do you trust that?" "I think I do," she said. "I've been far enough away from being hurt by him that I can see the whole picture of it now. He thought he was doing right by me. He was wrong about what that looked like, but the intention was something like love in the vocabulary of a man who learned love as control." She paused. "I pity him a little. I think his world was very small and he didn't know it was small." Emmett was quiet for a moment. "Your world got very large," he said. "It did," she said, and looked out the kitchen window at the 140 acres, and the Kansas sky going enormous overhead, blue and clean and absolutely unlimited, and thought, "Yes." August turned 5 in April of 1889, and began attending Miss Abbott's school with the energy of a child who had been waiting impatiently for this development. He sat in the front row and asked questions at a rate that Miss Abbott reported to Henrietta with equal parts admiration and exhaustion. He was not an easy student in the sense of quiet compliance, but he was an extraordinary student in the sense of genuine engagement, and Miss Abbott understood the difference. By the end of his first year, he was doing arithmetic 2 years above the standard, and had worn out every mechanical toy in the classroom. Clara, at 2, was already in the habit of following her brother, and then abandoning whatever he was doing in favor of her own direction the moment she found something more interesting, which was frequent. She had taken a passionate interest in the chickens, which she managed with a seriousness that Henrietta found both charming and completely unsurprising. She also had opinions, clearly articulated and early expressed, about what she wore and what she ate and where she sat, and Henrietta let her hold these opinions and express them and negotiate them rather than simply override them, because she remembered 24 years of having her preferences overridden, and she was not going to do that to her daughter. Emmett watched this approach with consistent approval and occasional delighted surprise. "You told her she could wear the old boots to supper," he said one evening after Clara had appeared at the table in the mud-caked work boots she'd been wearing in the chicken yard. She made the argument that they were on her feet and she was already sitting down and it didn't make sense to take them off and put them back on after, Henrietta said. "She was right," Emmett said. "I know, that's why I let her." Emmett looked at Clara, who was eating with entire concentration and complete satisfaction with the boots situation. "She's going to be remarkable," he said quietly. "She already is," Henrietta said. The winter of 1889 was kind, as Kansas winters occasionally condescended to be, and the spring of 1890 came early with a green so vivid, it seemed almost deliberate. Henrietta rode out on the bay mare one March morning, while Emmett was in the far pasture and August was at school, and Clara was with Vera, who kept her on Tuesdays now with the pleased authority of a woman who has decided to be a grandmother figure regardless of technical relation, and she rode along the creek where the cottonwoods were coming in again, the same trees she and Emmett had ridden past 7 years earlier on the first Sunday she'd found her seat. She was 32 years old. She had been in Caldwell for 8 years. She had 140 acres in her name alongside her husband's, 300 books in the lending library she'd helped build, 2 children who were learning early that they had the right to want things and say so, a community that was imperfect and that she was making incrementally more just, and a marriage that was the truest thing she had ever known. She thought about the woman who had stepped off that stagecoach in the red dust in 1882, gripping a carpetbag with both hands. That woman had been so empty of her own preferences that she couldn't have told you what she wanted for breakfast, let alone from a life. She had been scraped clean by years of being decided for, and the emptiness had felt like protection, because if you didn't have preferences you couldn't have them violated. She had filled, slowly and then quickly, and then with a rush that had surprised her with its velocity. She had filled with preferences and positions and passions and opinions and loves and specific, particular, irreplaceable things that were hers. The roan horse August was 15 now, which was old for a working horse, and Emmett had long since retired him from trail work and kept him in the south pasture where the grass was good. Henrietta rode by him on her way back, and he lifted his head and looked at her with old, dark, intelligent eyes, and she thought, "You first. You were the first sign." She rode home and found Emmett coming across the yard from the barn, still in his work jacket, and he raised his hand when he saw her and she raised hers, and this small thing, the raising of a hand across a yard, was so completely normal and so completely good that she had to sit with it for a moment on the mare before she dismounted. "Good ride?" he asked, taking the mare's bridle. "Very," she said. "I was thinking about—" She stepped down and stood beside him in the yard with the spring sun on both their faces. "About how it started," she said. "About what it's become." He looked at her with the full, steady attention that was still, after all these years, the most reliable and moving thing about him. He didn't rush the moment or fill it. He let it be what it was. "I have an idea," she said. "Tell me," he said. "I want to expand the library," she said. "I've been thinking about it for months. There are 30 children in that school now, and Miss Abbott says they need more reading material, and the territorial funding isn't sufficient. I want to make a real case to the town council for a permanent library building with a dedicated budget and a proper collection and someone paid to manage it properly, not just the post office shelf and what I can order on my own account." He was listening. He had always been listening. "I want to write up the full proposal myself," she continued, "with the financial argument and the educational evidence. I've been gathering the material. I think I can present it at the August meeting, and if it's done properly, it will pass." "It'll pass," he said with quiet certainty. "You're good at this." "I know," she said without false modesty, because that was another thing that had changed. She could name what she was good at without flinching from it. "What else?" he said, because he knew her. She smiled. "I want to plant more roses along the east fence this time. I want the yard to look like something in the summer." "All right. And I want to read that book you've been refusing to read since Christmas," she said. "The one about the Boston lawyer. You'll like it. You'd like it more if you read it." "I've told you this." "You have," he agreed. "The answer remains uncertain. Read the book, Emmett." "I'll think about it," he said, which was his version of yes. She took the mare's bridle from him and led her toward the stable, and he fell into step beside her. And the yard was warm, and the grass was greening, and August's school books were on the porch railing, where he'd left them this morning, and Clara's small boots were by the door, and the roses along the south fence were beginning to bud in the particular deep red that she had loved since the first time she saw them come up. She had never once been asked what she wanted. And then one man had asked and sat quietly and waited, and she had spent the last 8 years discovering the answer in full. It was a very long list, as it turned out. She was still adding to it. The library proposal was written over 4 evenings in July, with August asleep upstairs and Clara in her crib and Emmett at the table going over his own ranch accounts, the lamp between them making a warm circle of light in the Kansas dark. She wrote carefully and revised honestly and read sections to Emmett when she wanted a reaction. And he gave reactions that were useful and specific and occasionally critical in the constructive way she had learned to appreciate as one of the genuine gifts of a marriage between two honest people. She presented the proposal at the August Town Council meeting in 1890, the same month her son turned 6 and began second year with Miss Abbott with a list of questions he had been saving since June. The council chamber was crowded, which surprised her, but then she learned that word had gone around that Henrietta Hartwell was presenting something, and her reputation in town meetings was by this point established well enough that people came to see what she would say. She said it clearly, methodically, and with the financial evidence laid out in a document that anyone present could examine. She cited the number of children enrolled in school and the growth projections for the town over the next decade as the railroad continued to bring settlers through. She cited comparable library operations in Dodge City and in Wichita. She presented a budget that was specific and defensible. Thomas Groundhog, who had been voted onto the town council the previous year, in a development that Henrietta had worked toward quietly and with considerable patience for 2 years, seconded her motion without hesitation. Lee Nguyen, now 19 and working in the land office and present as a citizen rather than in any official capacity, spoke briefly and persuasively about the library's role in his own education. Nora Groundhog, 11 years old and sitting beside her father with her arms folded and her expression fierce, had not been planning to speak, but stood up at the last moment and said, in a clear, carrying voice, that she had read 22 of the library's books in the last year, and that the botanical manual Mrs. Hartwell had given her had told her she wanted to be a naturalist, and that she thought everyone should have books that told them what they wanted to be. The motion passed. Henrietta gathered her papers and looked across the room to where Emmett was standing at the back wall, as he always was at these meetings, present, supportive, unobtrusive. And he met her eyes, and something passed between them that had no adequate word, only the particular warmth of two people who have built something together and can see it clearly in the light. The library building was completed in the spring of 1891, a small frame structure beside the school, with windows on both sides and shelves that Emmett and Thomas Groundhog built on a Saturday in March that ended with all 4 of their collective children underfoot and coffee going on the stove and Pete Duckett appearing from somewhere with a story about a horse that took 40 minutes to tell, and the shelves were excellent. Henrietta was named the library's first official director, which was an unpaid position, but which came with a modest operating budget for acquisitions, and the deep, specific satisfaction of having built something from nothing that would outlast her. She ordered books with the care of someone who understood what it meant to have the right book at the right moment. She had been changed by books, had had her world opened by them in the years when her actual world was closed, and she took the responsibility of choosing them with a seriousness that felt like gratitude. She ordered botanical manuals and novels and histories and practical guides to farming and law and medicine. She ordered a book about engineering that she put on the shelf with the mental note that, when August was a few years older, she was going to put it directly in his hands. She ordered a collection of Cherokee traditional stories that she found after some research through a bookseller in Tahlequah, and she gave them to Thomas with the same directness she brought to everything. He looked at the books and then at her and said, "Thank you, Henrietta. I want this library to have things that belong to everyone who uses it," she said. "Not just the people who were already given everything." He nodded. "I know," he said. "You've always known that." She walked home from the library that evening through the spring evening, the sky above Caldwell going from blue to gold, to the particular rose and violet of a Kansas sunset that she had never tired of in 8 years, and she thought about all the rooms she had walked through in her life, the rooms she had been placed in and the rooms she had chosen, and she understood that the choosing was the whole of it, not the rooms themselves, not the things in them or even the people, the choosing. She had been given back to herself in stages, starting with a stagecoach in red dust and ending, she thought, never, because she was still learning the dimensions of herself, still finding edges she hadn't known were there, and preferences she hadn't examined and capacities she was only beginning to develop. The ending, the permanent, comfortable ending, was not a stopping but a belonging. She belonged to this place and this life and this man and these children and herself, and all of those belongings were things she had arrived at by her own direction. Emmett was on the porch when she came home, August beside him showing him something on a small piece of paper, a drawing, or a plan. It was impossible to tell from the road, but they were bent over it together with matching intensity, his father's dark head and his own dark head inclined toward the same point of interest. Clara was in the chicken yard with the serious absorption of a 3-year-old managing important poultry affairs. She stopped at the gate and looked at all of this. Emmett glanced up and saw her there, and in the easy way of 8 years of knowing each other, he understood something about the expression on her face because he said to August, "Give me a minute, Bud," and came down the porch steps and crossed the yard to the gate. "All right," he said. "More than all right," she said. "The library's shelves are full." "I know," he said. "I built them to hold a good weight." "They'll need more shelves in 3 years," she said. "I'll build them," he said. She opened the gate and walked through, and the evening was warm and the roses along the south fence were in their second summer of growth and beginning to be truly magnificent, and she went up the porch steps, and August showed her his plan. It was a plan for a device he wanted to build that would move water from the creek uphill to the garden without carrying it by hand, a plan that was mostly correct and completely ambitious. And Clara came in from the chicken yard with her boots dirty and her expression satisfied, and reported that 3 eggs had been laid today, and one of them was very large, and she had opinions about this. Supper was made and eaten, and the table was loud with the particular noise of a house that is full of people who are genuinely interested in each other's business, and afterward the children were put to bed in stages. Clara easily, August after one more thing he just thought of about the water device, which Emmett engaged with seriously for 10 minutes before redirecting him firmly toward sleep. They sat on the porch in the late evening, the two of them, with the dark and the stars and the Kansas night sounds around them, crickets and the far-off sound of cattle and the creek moving over stones in the dark, and she leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and they were quiet together in the way of people who have learned that quiet is not absence but a kind of fullness. "I've been thinking about the list," she said after a while. "The want list," he said. "The want list," she confirmed. "I think it might be complete, for the moment, Not forever, I'll add to it. But right now, looking at what I've got, I think I have all of the things on the current list. He was quiet for a moment, and she could feel him thinking, the particular quality of his thoughtfulness that she knew as intimately as her own heartbeat. "What's the last item?" he asked. She thought about how to say it. "This," she finally said. "Exactly this. Sitting here knowing that everything I have is something I chose." He held her a little tighter. The stars above Kansas were the same ones she'd stood under the night she'd argued for Thomas Groundhog's water rights and Emmett had found her hand in the dark. And they were the same stars that had burned over the stagecoach pulling into Caldwell with a woman gripping a carpetbag. And they were the same stars that had always been there and would go on being there, indifferent and enormous, over a landscape that didn't care about any of them. But she cared. She was here in this specific light on this specific porch, beside this specific man who had asked her a question once and waited quietly while she found her way to the answer. And the answer was this life, this full and chosen and entirely her own life. And she had arrived at it by her own compass, and she was going to keep living it by her own compass until she was done. She was nowhere near done. The last thing she did before going inside that evening was to lean over the porch rail and look at the roses along the south fence, which were dark shapes in the late dark but which she knew by heart, every cane, every cluster, every particular deep red of the blooms that had given her daughter her middle name. She had planted them herself. She had decided what they were and where they went and what they meant. A small thing, her own thing entirely. She went inside to the lamplit house, to Emmett following her through the door and the children sleeping above and the books on the shelf and the plan for August's water device on the kitchen table, and she thought, here. This is here. This is the answer. She had figured it out.